Complexity essentially is the difference between three types of systems: ordered systems, complex systems, and chaotic systems. Defining this in terms of constraints and the closing of those constraints. The language by which we define things should be the language by which we change things. Contrast: by having a separate language for description from the language for intervention, it's more difficult to make the transition between the three system types. An ordered system is one with a very high level of constraint. The constraints are so high that all behavior is predictable. Contrast: order has value for us, but the trouble is, we don't understand the context and therefore tend to inappropriately group or associate. If you don't understand the why, you shouldn't replicate the what. Example: you don't fight a bureaucracy by arguing rationally on the basis of evidence-based approaches to customer or employee need, because the bureaucracy invokes a sense of predecision outside of the value stream. However, it makes sense to ask innocent questions in the hope that people will realize the predecisions won't work, and therefore create an exception. We are pattern-based decision makers. We don't see things we don't expect to see. Just because we see something doesn't mean we will pay attention to it. Just because we pay attention to it doesn't mean we will act on it. If you over-constrain a system which isn't naturally constrainable, people have to find ways to work around the system. It is an over-application of ordered approaches to control, and not a recognition that not all systems are ordered. Example: to attempt to introduce best practices and frameworks as a way of creating order within an enterprise, which creates resistance to change and the associative knock-on effect of moving the enterprise into a state of complexity. So the order intent that the processes, frameworks, and best practices try to introduce creates a new behavior of gaming the system, resulting in the feedback of a self-perpetuating illusion of success. A chaotic system is one where there are no connections or no connectivity. The agent's behaviors are boundless. As an unplanned state, we can call this a crisis event, like your vaccine Sunday. However, in contrast, as a planned activity, it can be quite powerful. Examples of these are the approach chaos engineering, which is a disciplined approach to identifying failures before they become outages. We need to appreciate chaos money was pioneered by Netflix to uncover the weaknesses in their systems. A complex system is one that has multiple paths to multiple answers. When you toss in the word adaptive, you end up with a system that changes based on the choices that you make, and as a result of these choices, the answers change. Using constraints as our control, a complex adaptive system is one which has enabling constraints rather than governing constraints. I commonly use the term support rails over guardrails because of the familiarity and go-to-state people have with the term guardrails. Support required changes over time and therefore is adaptive, where guardrails are decision points regardless of the situational or material circumstance. Dave Snowden shared a great analogy in this by association of the skeleton. The difference is like an exoskeleton versus an endoskeleton. An ordered system is like the exoskeleton, the external skeleton of an insect or mammal. It has a rigid shell that is not going to change, but within it things may change. An endoskeleton, on the other hand, is like our spine. It gives coherence, but doesn't contain completely, so you benefit from huge amounts of variation around it. Looking back at nature, we see that aside from the tortoise, which is associated with both in the loosest possible term, there is no creation that benefits from both enabling and governance systems. Either they are sustained by an exoskeleton or they are sustained by an endoskeleton system. This is of huge importance for governance. How do you create enabling constraints that effectively allow locally valid solutions to emerge within the governance framework? This is to create a dissolution of the levels of governance as a constraint, and I think people associate a fair bit of confusion around this. It is not that we don't govern, but we govern in a method appropriate to the system. This is the key message on complexity. Dependent on which system you are in, you can operate in a different way. An illustration of this is the difference between rules and heuristics. Rule breaking should not be made habitual by the system and has links to an over-ordered system, which I touched on earlier. A heuristic, also called mental shortcuts or rules of thumb, is a mental shortcut that allows people to solve problems and make judgments quickly and efficiently. These rule of thumb strategies shorten decision-making time and allow people to function without constantly stopping to think about their next course of action. We use heuristics to control uncertainty. If you have a rule about when rules can be broken, it's safer. Switching from governing heuristics to enabling heuristics, we can ritualize this transfer. A business rule is a regulation that defines or restricts actions within an organization's operations. They're statements that guide behavior and determine where, when, why, and how to carry out business tasks. If we take the enterprise's desire to introduce order to a chaotic system, we can consider two actors, the governing system owner and the intended adopters. If we take the enterprise's desire to introduce narrative records of their cycle through process adoption, we can have an empirical measure of the impact of the governance framework process on their perception of value as directed by the enterprise, making those patterns visible and operational. We replace static coordinated measures of value/success such as questionnaires, professionals interviewing, assurance-based feedback mechanisms, and the other directional metrics. We can see those patterns. Then we have a network we can ask questions of in real time. And we can also detect in real time small early indications of attitudes to governance failure and process frameworking. Another problem besides gifting and gaming in questionnaires is that you cannot trust the honesty of people. Working groups are typically biased within a short time by a good facilitator, and therefore, any value from that session is the facilitator's directive. The facilitator privileges some response over others. Questionnaires are linear and reactive. 2 months to commission it, 1 month to run it, a huge amount of cost, 2 months to interpret it. Nobody really understands it, so you spend more money with consultants to interpret it. We need real-time response. We need real-time feedback for an evidence-based process. We can't afford to wait for a linear process. Have we all done questionnaires? There are several problems with questionnaires. First of all, the really scary stuff, if you allow people to evaluate, they lock options down too fast. Asking people to evaluate a service or themselves, they worry about what the perception is. Description keeps options open, evaluation closes options down. The minute you ask an evaluative question, you cannot trust the result. This is a problem with traditional 360 feedback. You can gift or game it. We take a different approach. We go to 5% of the workforce every month and ask, what story would you tell your best friend if they were offered a job in your workplace? That's called a non-hypothesis-based question. Then we say, where would you place this story? And give them 6 triangles, where one of the triangle's vertices are altruistic, assertive, analytical. Notice that those are 3 positive qualities. In cognitive terms, that engages the novelty-receptive part of the brain, not the autonomic side of the brain. So you think more about it, and you don't know what the right answer is, so you can't gift or game. Then the executive or the company sees their balance toward analytical and haven't got altruistic. So then we get into this massive, radical new theory of change. You look at the observations and say, what can I go do tomorrow to create more observations like these and fewer observations like that? Advocacy is not hard-baked into the process. The first decision you have to make is an ontological decision. Which type of system are we? If you assume the system is chaotic, it means that the actors are unconstrained and their behavior is random. The ordered approach, on the other hand, is taught in all good business schools. Under this, it is of critical importance to agree on the learning objectives in advance. The learning objectives should be aligned with the mission statement for enterprise and should be clearly articulated and printed off on motivational literature and to drive an unconscious cognition of alignment. Then by producing a product plan for the delivery with clear milestones throughout the life cycle of the delivery against which you can measure progress against ideal enterprise outcomes. Following the highly successful completion of the delivery, you conduct an after-action review, update your best practice database on that delivery type, and mandate future process improvements. If at this stage for any remote reason the participants are unhappy, you add coaches who will get them to tell happy clappy stories. So they have happy mental models and suitably indoctrinated. They will like whatever you put in front of them next time. The complex systems approach, on the other hand, is much simpler. We start off by drawing a line in the sand, known as a boundary in complexity theory, and we look the children solidly in the eye and say, cross it you little bastards and you die. One of the things you learn pretty fast as an adult is the value of flexible negotiable boundaries, because rigid boundaries have a habit of becoming brittle and breaking catastrophically. We then introduce catalytic probes. I'm deliberately using technical language here because you need to think differently about this. If we don't change language, we don't change the way that people think. We introduce probes, safe-to-fail experiments. A football, a video, a BBQ, a computer game. We see if a pattern forms. If it does, it's called an attractor. If it's beneficial, other kids will get attracted to it. They will start to play. At which point, so we don't take resources away or we give it resources. If it's negative, well, that's where you need the fire hoses. We manage the emergence of beneficial coherence within attractors within boundaries, and that allows locally valid solutions to emerge. Everything that science is telling us is about systematic change, not individual change. You can change people's interactions, and then they can choose how they change. And you can achieve more systematic change faster by changing people's interactions, because we evolved as community-based intelligences, not as atomistic individuals. We are not the isolated individuals, having an atomistic view focused on the individual. We are communitarian entities at our heart. Understanding that is key. If you don't have the systems to support things, it doesn't matter what individuals think, it will go down. Until you change the system, nobody will change. It's not good enough to just focus on individual change. We got to focus on systematic change. Where people are working for explicit goals, it destroys intrinsic motivation. That leads us into what we're talking about as vector targets, not outcome targets. Vector targets measure direction and speed of travel, and therefore can sustain novel practice, whereas outcome-based targets cannot. Narrative is key to identity. It is the stories of people's day-to-day lives which give them power. Fundamentally, cultures matter. It is not for you to decide what narrative people should have. It's for you to influence their current narratives to see if you can create a more sustainable one, not to decide to impose a narrative that is called propaganda, but to understand the current narratives and try to shift and influence and direct them through action, not through words. Example of getting people to identify all the decisions made recently which affected them personally, which illustrate what this organization is like to work for. This is something you can do on a continuous basis over a week or month. Decisions that people feel affect them tell you more about an organization than anything else, and it also gives you a good decision map.